And it's hard to comprehend. A new
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for one of our last programs in this month of Women's History. My name is Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson, and I am Dean of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities here at Shaw University. I welcome all of you to what will be a delightful afternoon. Before I get started to give you the format and setup for our program, I would like to to ask President Dillard if she has a couple of remarks to make to set us off. And after that, we will go with our programming. President Dillard, delighted to see you.
Good afternoon, Dean Johnson. It is indeed an honor to wind up this Women's History Month with the recognition of women in academia. It is so appropriate. I am looking forward to hearing from our esteemed panelists. And I am so grateful that each one of them agreed to spend time with us here at Shaw, showing what women in leadership positions can do as we look at our student body makeup and what this means to young women who are in the academy. So thanks everybody and welcome.
Thank you so much. So the theme for today's discussion has to do with celebrating and recognizing women who are contributing something today. I know this is Women's History Month, but we wanted to give an opportunity to some outstanding women to talk about their work and to frame it in their own words so that we will hear from them their path forward and what they were able to accomplish so far. These are women who are contributing every single day. So our format will be, they will speak to some questions that I gave to them and give introductory remarks for about 10 minutes. And then after they do that, we will open up a little conversation between the four of us as the topics arise. And then we will give the concluding part of the program for questions and answers from all of you all who have tuned in. So I will begin, and I'm not giving lengthy introductions because my panelists have all agreed to talk about themselves a little bit as they do their introductory remarks. So I will give you all three, and then after that, they will begin, and we'll be beginning with Dr. Annette Rodriguez, who is an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Next, we will have Dr. Tamara Holmes Brothers, who's Deputy Director of the North Carolina Arts Council. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Katja Mavorak, and she is from Grinnell College in Iowa. She's Professor of Anthropology and Women's Studies. So I turn it to you, Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Johnson. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, thank you so much, Dean Johnson, for bringing us together on this really beautiful spring day. You may be able to hear some bird song behind me. That is part of what sustains me, this beautiful North Carolina weather and the beautiful wildlife around me. So I want to thank Dean Johnson for being here and bringing us together. I really want to thank President Dillard for joining us as well. What an honor to speak with all of you. Thank you all for joining us on the other side of your screens. So by way of introduction, I want to begin answering some of Dean Johnson's persistently important questions she gave to us, but really boil down to what we do and how we sustain what we do. So I received my PhD from Brown University. I also received a master's degree there. And I had previously received my bachelor's degree and a master's degree from the University of New Mexico. I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I teach in the Department of American Studies. So I came to Chapel Hill after teaching at a number of Hispanic serving and Native serving institutions in New Mexico. And that commitment is still quite important to me. I've worked to pair some of my courses here at Chapel Hill with some English as a second language courses at the community college at Siler City. So that's an important commitment to me always. Now at Chapel Hill, I teach both graduate and undergraduate courses in US history and US culture. And for me, it's very important to expand our sense of what is US history and what is US culture. So anytime I list off or talk about some of what my accomplishments are, I can do so confidently because I know that they are not solely mine. These are not things I earned on my own. And so I talk about them with respect to who brought me to this place. So that includes my auntie Apollonia, who saved me as a toddler when I ran across 4 lanes of traffic on a rural highway. That aunt later dedicatedly took me to the bookmobile and taught me how to read. And she never forgets to remind me of that. It also includes my mom, who learned English as a second language, who loved word games and crossword puzzles as I was growing up.
40 activities
to me every night.
them
My mom also has the best vocabulary and the most precise vocabulary of anyone I know. It includes my dad, who struggled to read the Bible, but he always worked at it, scripture by scripture, word by word, asking friends and deacons and ministers for help. Both of my parents quit high school, but never stopped learning and never stopped being curious. This includes my mentors who helped shape my curiosity and really my being critical of the stories that I was told about history, about people of color, about women. They helped me to shape those questions into a process that I am so grateful has become my life's work of questioning, of learning to ask better and more generative questions, and of writing and of teaching. So I quit high school at age 16, and I received my GED a year after that, after working with my dad on construction sites and being like, okay, this ain't it. I need to figure out what my purpose is. And so when I first went off to college, I quit twice for lack of any real cultural competency that would help me be successful in that world. And it took me a few tries to understand what that project was for me. What was academia for me? I wasn't someone born into it. I wasn't like some of my colleagues who had had parents who'd gone off to college. And so as a returning student, after those sort of unsuccesses, wow, I got it, right? And once I got it, once I got that I was thinking through the expansiveness of history and what it means that we are historical actors, Then I was, as we say, cooking with gas, right? And so, you know, Dean Johnson has asked us to think forward as well, as to what some of our goals might be as we continue our work. I know that my first clear goal is to continue to earn the opportunity to teach, to stand in front of a classroom once we're back in classrooms. That's important to me, to encourage not only other, you know, short, brown, first gen women to seize their place, but also to give other folks the experience of submitting to the scholarly authority of someone unexpected at the front of that classroom. I always joke about being the unexpected Mexican in many places. And in front of the classroom is one of those places. And so it does something important for people who may identify with me or with my life experience. But it also does something equally as important for those who don't identify with me or my life experience. My other goals are to put some books on my mom's shelves with some names in them that look and sound like ours, with some names of some of our hometowns, with descriptions of our historical experience or our context. And I'm happy if a few of those books have my name on the binding, because I know what pride it gives my parents and my people to know how right they did by me to get me in this place. And every week, I make sure to set aside a good amount of my schedule to mentorship, to talking with students who may also not know all the cultural norms of being in the academy, and who just need someone to talk with them about things like filling out a FAFSA, choosing a major, deciding what to do next, and finding purpose in all of that. And so thank you all so much for having me. I'm so happy to have this conversation with you, and keep in touch. You can find me on the website of UNC's Chapel Hill American Studies link. And there you can find my contact information and more about me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. And we'll get more into your story as we talk further. And again, yes, the surprising package of authority in this little short Mexican woman is that is a picture that I now have, but it's an important one, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Next, now we will have Dr. Tamara Holmes Brothers.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson, and thank you, President Dillard, for again providing this space for us and including me into this space. I'll talk a little bit about what inspired and directed me to do the work that I do as currently the Deputy Director for the North Carolina Arts Council. Growing up, I'm sure many of you can remember the TV show A Different World, which was one of my favorite shows. There was a character by Whitley Gilbert, well, Jasmine Guy's character, Whitley Gilbert, was to become a corporate art buyer upon graduation. I attended Hampton University's Summer Bridge pre-college program and changed my major from biology to art that summer. So completely two ends of the spectrum. But little do a lot of people know that Hampton University has a renowned African-American and African art collection on campus at the students' disposal. So I volunteered my freshman year at the Hampton University Museum, which afforded me a work study opportunity the remainder of my tenure at Hampton University, and interning in a program to encourage minorities into art conservation. The internship was entitled To Conserve a Legacy, American Art from Historically Black Colleges and Universities. During this time, I spent a month at the Addison Gallery of American Art on the campus of Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, as well as another month at the Williamstown Art Conservation Center in Williamstown, Massachusetts, near Williams College, where ironically General Armstrong went to college, the founder of Hampton University. So it was kind of divine intervention that I was a part of that specific program. I didn't have a direct path to my current role. My senior year at Hampton University, the university dissolved their museum studies program. So I worked for a year and a half before going to grad school to receive my master's in sport management at West Virginia University. Again, the complete opposite end of the spectrum. But upon receiving my MS in sport management, I interned at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in the curatorial and education departments, combining both degrees of art and sport management. So I worked also for an arena football team in the front office. I've worked in tourism and the hospitality sector, as well as in higher education development fundraising. Having such an eclectic background, I always stayed involved in the arts, building my CV. So when the opportunity arose for me to transition into the arts full time, I would be ready. So I spent some time at Fayetteville State University in their Department of Institutional Advancement. For 11 years, I was there. And when the opportunity came about for me to make that transition, I took it. So I became the director for development and major gifts at the National Museum of Art at Duke University. Since then, I've become the deputy director at the North Carolina Arts Council. Now, I know Dean Johnson wanted us to talk about some of our triumphs as well, but I've had a lifetime of firsts, being the only Black or one of few. First and foremost, I was labeled a statistic before birth. I was born to a single mother, I was born Black, and I was born female. So the social norms already expected that my pathway to prosperity would be limited. However, I was raised in a family of strong women who encouraged self-awareness, an educational background, and a strong sense of cultural heritage. We always talked about education, politics, and culture, so walking in my truth has never been an option for me. Not walking in my truth has never been an option for me. Some of my triumphs to date, I was the first Black to win the JCPenney Who's Arizona Gene competition, which was a national essay scholarship contest. That scholarship alone paid for my first year at Hampton University. My mom, being a single parent, she said, if you get yourself into school, I'll make sure you stay there. So I took the challenge to write this essay and I won, surprisingly. I was the first Black to intern at the National Baseball Hall of Fame Museum in a program entitled Frank and Peggy Steele Internship for Student Leadership and Development. I was the second Black female president of the West Fayetteville Rotary Club. I'm originally from Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I was also the first person of color in senior leadership at the National Museum of Art in the existence of the museum's history. And again, the first person of color in senior leadership in the existence of the North Carolina Arts Council as well. So again, kind of going outside of the norms has been consistent in my life. There have been some challenges, of course, along the way in order to achieve the position that I hold now. I have overcome and still endure at times environments of suppression, passive aggression, and dismissal of the lived experience of white supremacy. Again, I'm a Black female in the arts of all things, and in the American South at that. There was a time when I was on chest pain medication in a previous job, and I would pray coming, during, and going home from work. I asked God to show me why I was going through what I was encountering. So be careful what you ask for, because I received an answer. The answer that I heard in my ear, that this was a spiritual boot camp for me. I learned that I had to go through what I experienced in order to do the work that I'm leading now. And as a director for the North Carolina Arts Council, I'm charged with responsibilities to recommend policies that realize the agency's mission for arts for all people. And over the last 10 months, I started during COVID of all things, in May of last year. I've navigated complex conversations about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. This is what we call our DEAI in the arts. I don't just design, develop, and implement agency programs. I also develop partnerships to bring about transformational change. That is what I truly wanted to do. And also identifying and supporting target areas to maximize the agency's impact locally, regionally, and nationally as well. In regards to some goals that I have for myself for the future, my next goal is, of course, to be an executive director or president of an arts organization. And I also pretty much like to keep my options open because you never know what God has prepared for you. So I like to keep my options open beyond that.
Thank you so much, Tamara. And again, we'll pick up the thread. I have a couple of questions, but one thing you remind us of the importance of internships, and we'll get back to that as well, because that seems to be a key thread. Now, finally, not the least, but one of the best will be my colleague and friend, Dr. Katja Merova.
Thank you very much, Dean Johnson, and also President Dillard for this opportunity to participate with you. And I'm going to say that I'm speaking off the top of my head, but I've given it a lot of thought. So I'm also the oldest of our speakers. Let me begin with the fact that I am an immigrant. My children are immigrants. My parents were immigrants. So there's immigration throughout our lines. My father was from Jamaica. His mother was Cuban, of Dominican Republic, Jamaica. It all is Caribbean. My mother was a refugee from Nazi Austria. The United States government did not want to give visas when my grandparents applied. My grandmother's sister was living in America. She begged the doctor, she was a nurse, she begged the doctor for whom she worked, please sign the affidavit. United States, you do need an affidavit to be able to have, to show that somebody is going to support you if you should not have the means. That has been consistent over time. So questions about immigration, both in the United States and other countries, is significant to me. My grandparents received the visa, but not my great-grandmother, for whom I'm named. She and the rest of the family were murdered in the camps. My parents met in New York City. I was born and raised in New York City and grew up in New York. All of the family friends, I think, were part of the left, from Communist Party to just socialists. My parents were unable to follow dogma, so they were never members of the party. And New York City, as some of you know, is very global and very transnational. That hasn't changed. There just simply are more people from many more countries. When I was growing up, there were three major groups: West Indian, Black American, Irish, Italian, Puerto Ricans, and Jews. That was the extent of the world in which I lived until I was about in 7th grade. In 7th grade, I went to an elite private school, the Brearley School. I was the first Black student in my class. So, you know, that's one of the firsts. That school is now has children from lots of different places. And I want to come back to the topic of diversity in the phrase people of color, because I take issue very often with the notion of people of color, the way that it's translated, the way that it circulates in the public arena. In any case, being Jewish, I was, when I graduated, I decided to move to Israel, where I moved, and I stayed for 21 years. So I'm an Israeli citizen as well as an American citizen with permanent residency in France, which is a whole other story. I won't complicate it too much. I got married. I dropped out of school, college. My father in America was not happy about that whatsoever. I had 3 children. And one day I had a letter from my dad. The back was from the National Urban League, and it said, I think, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. So I went back and re-enrolled in school. I got my BA in African Studies, and then I continued with a master's in African Studies with a focus on South Africa. So I was active in the anti-apartheid movement in Israel. And then when my oldest was going into 11th grade, and he would have then gone to 12th grade, I thought, I wonder what it's like in the States. I had a friend who was Palestinian Israeli, and she was applying for her PhD in the States. So I thought, maybe I'll apply. Maybe I'll see what it's like to live in the United States. And I don't like big cities. So I wondered, what school can I apply to that's going to be a PhD of esteem, but in a city that would not be too complicated for me to navigate with 3 children. And it was then my husband, he's now my ex-husband, and we picked Durham, North Carolina. So I applied, I said, I'll apply to one place. If I get in, great. And if I don't get in, that's fine also. The Gulf War came. I forgot about the fact that I'd applied. Gulf War ended around March. I go to the post office and there's a big envelope. And I tell my students, if there's a big envelope, it's good news. If it's a thin envelope, it can wait for the next day to open. And sure enough, I was accepted. And I thought, well, let me just go to the States and see what that might be like. Because I had remembered Durham in my time, 69, 70, when some of the siblings of my classmates were going to the South. I thought of Durham, North Carolina as completely Jim Crow. So I had no idea what that might be like. Coming back, we came for a visit. I'd only applied to one place. I did not like it at all. But I had applied and I'd been accepted. So I took the jump. I went to Duke, and that's where I got my PhD. I got my PhD in cultural anthropology. Now, to backtrack just a little bit, and let me know if I'm trying to look at the clock. I fell into the interstices of discipline. So I am in between cultural studies and cultural anthropology, politics, political economy. For me, it's a very European background in education, so it's all interdisciplinary, and I approach questions from a broad range, just as I approach my own life from a broad range. Some of the triumphs to date, well, getting a PhD was a big triumph, and proving to my grandparents that I could be studious, that I wasn't just flighty, and that they shouldn't be disappointed. And having a published book with my name, as Dr. Rodriguez said, it's really great to have your own name the first time on a book cover. And it was Duke University Press. It was hardcover and soft cover, so that was really exciting. Some of the challenges are always about competition and about ego. And so I will share this at this early stage. When I graduated from Duke, a group of Black women, half of whom had law degrees and from Ivy League schools and were going back for a PhD, we met together. And this Duke, as you know, is not a historically Black institution, it's historically a white institution. But one of the things which I said was, when you form your committee, make sure that you have old white men. Why? Because old white men don't really care. Therefore, they will allow you and push you to do what you want to do rather than try to remake you. That was my experience. The younger people who look like you may not necessarily want you to succeed because they want you to do what they feel will help them be mentors that will gain recognition. That's very, very different. So that was one of my lessons, was not to automatically assume that somebody who looked like me had my best interests at heart. What are my other triumphs today? Teaching. I try to teach my students to look in the mirror and recognize themselves as their first champions. I tried to get them to do what my mother, especially my mother, who was very important to my education, to do what my mother said was, you're not a victim. You are never a victim. You are always empowered. You empower yourself. If you're waiting for other people to compliment you, you can wait a very long time. If you're stopped because people try to disempower you, if that stops you, then you're not working hard enough. So I still take that into account when I teach my students, that they have the power within themselves. And I always think about Malcolm X. I have a longer quote from him, but just the one sentence, which is, it's not the nature of power to back up in the face of anything but more power. So having a PhD, having a credential doesn't necessarily make you smarter, but does mean that people have to pay attention when you say, no, it's not doctor, it's professor. And no, you may not use my first name. I don't know you. So that was pretty important to me. To kind of close off, I will continue to work to work against the idea that race is biological, that good science means transcending the racial categories that are in the federal government indexing for the purpose of discrimination, but that when it comes to health and well-being, racism is the disease, not what race you have been assigned. And this has become very, very important to me as increasingly, especially in the last year, I think, too much of the public conversation is driven by the idea of identities. I identify as Jewish, I identify as Black, I identify as Israeli, I identify with the politics of making the world a better place, but ultimately my activities in the public sphere, in the classroom is the public sphere, those for me are political acts. They are about trying to make the world a better place, doing my small part. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate all the perspectives all three of you are bringing to the table, as and y'all can see why I wanted to have this conversation with these women. Speaking of an identity. But what I'd like to do now, I'm going to ask maybe just one question. We've got about half an hour, and I do want to make sure that people are able to ask the questions they want to ask. So please put them in the chat. That's going to be moderated so that we will get to your questions if you put them in the chat. But I do have some questions, and I also asked the panelists if they have questions of one another that they would use this time, the next 5 minutes or so, to ask each other questions. But I'm going to take privilege of moderator and explore a little further the statement that you made, Professor. See, I want to call you Professor Katja because that's how you are in my head. But the question has to do with diversity and what we mean by diversity, inclusion, people of color. You start us off thinking there's some tension there. And I'd like each of you to discuss your perspective on this whole diversity inclusion moment that we're in.
Did you want me to start?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that the terminology of diversity has become commodified. It's been commodified for a long time. And to be honest with you, a very close friend of mine, when we were in graduate school, said, you know what, Katja, they're talking about multiculturalism. That was the key word, the buzzword. He said, we should open and he was Black from Arkansas. We should open a company. And sure enough, 5 years later, we began to have the diversity consultants, and now it's become big business, but it doesn't tackle real issues. It sidetracks us. At my institution, a lot of time is spent with this new diversity training. You don't need diversity training. I go back to perhaps it's my generation, perhaps it's the Jamaicans, perhaps it's the Jewish refugees on my side, but this idea that you want people to like you, to get along, that's very different from do your job. Your job is to, if you're a professor, your job is to teach. If you're a teacher in school, your job is to access all of your students and recruit all of their abilities, cultivate it, nurture it, and their success will reflect on you. I think that we're in a moment of a certain kind of white liberalism that is not what it was in the 60s, because people are smarter, but it is something which is moving us far away from the needs of any environment. Kids in school, let's say K through 12, and I won't go too far in this, but K through 12, they need good resources in the school. The teachers don't need diversity training about culture, because my grandmother, who was from Jamaica, and my grandmother, who was from Austria, they barely understood each other, but they understood each other a lot better than either understood American Blacks on the one hand or American Jews on the other. So it's not about that kind of putting people and deciding what their cultural values are. It is deciding, how do you do your job? How do you make sure that there are diverse people in the room with diverse experiences and not just some artificial kind of homogeneity that is then called, oh, we're meeting our diversity needs. So we don't have accountability. We just have vocabulary at the moment.
Thank you. Annette, Tamara, either one of you want to also speak to this?
Sure, I can chime in. I think in regards to continue the conversation of diversity for my particular environment and working with the North Carolina Arts Council in granting funds for individual artists and arts organizations, looking at diversity from a governance perspective, who's in the room, examining the agency's makeup to determine whose voice is missing from the decision-making table. I mentioned earlier, with me being the first person of color of any race in senior leadership at the North Carolina Arts Council, it's taken 54 years for this to take place. And during this time of what I like to think of our dual pandemic, the physical isolation of COVID-19 and the emotional isolation of the social injustice that is blatant for everyone to see. As a Black woman, I've always known that it was apparent, but I think people are more cognizant of it now, or are starting to acknowledge it because it's blatant and in our face, because we've had to shelter in place and see what took place with George Floyd and so many countless others on television. Looking at who's at the table, looking at the hiring practices of arts organizations and who is in that room, looking at equity and who's trying to get into room but can't. For example, all those organizations of color that haven't received funding support from the Arts Council. So looking at the historical practices of the grant-making policies that have taken place over 50 plus years, and looking to modify those practices and creating new categories for organizations of color and individual artists to submit their proposals for. And then again, with inclusion, looking at the workplace, has everyone's ideas been heard? Diverse staff shouldn't just be, it should become more common. It shouldn't be a commodity to have one or two people of various races in one organization, and looking at the administration, the executive leadership, and again, looking at the policies, procedures, and ultimately the behaviors of an organization. A lot of people think that diversity and inclusion is an HR issue, and it can be accomplished by training workshops. It cannot, because it's an ongoing practice. It's a lifestyle, essentially. And people bring into the workplace what they know. It's the organizational culture and the organizational behaviors that have to change.
Thank you. And Dr. Annette, do you have something to contribute to this?
I mean, what I will say is, I think Dr. Brothers has really brought a very critical point, which is it matters who's in the room, right? It matters who is in the room. That is something that's very clear. And Professor Mevarak, I think, has brought us to the tension there, which is that the question of diversity and inclusion is not just simply representational, right? And so I know for me as an historian, the way I think about it is that, the questions we have and that we explore and we write about, teach about, those questions emerge out of our lived experience. They don't emerge out of, me as a Mexican woman. They emerge out of the experience of my family, who again, is part of this, migrant background, this question of, what it means, how the world may look different for us, how we ask different kinds of questions, how that experience can inform the institutions who we give the benefit of our time and our service and our love. And so, so we can sort of keep steady and focus on the work we have to do in the world. And, we're often required to be more rigorous than others who aren't sort of seen as the diversity person in that room, right? But I think it's so important to keep in mind that tension. It does matter who's in the room. But not because of this sort of representational sense, more because of, the fact that we all have different lived experiences, different questions and perspectives to explore when we're in these spaces with one another.
Thank you. Professor Meveroff has another comment to make, and then I'm again encouraging folks to put your questions in the chat.
Yes, I just want to call attention, as I always try to do. Race is biological. It's not a synonym for color. It's useful. It's continuing to be used in order to monitor discrimination. But when people speak about races today, and it falls right into the category of medicine and of health, it would be much better to speak about racism or discrimination or exclusion. We need more representation in the room of diverse faces, of diverse points of view. But one of the things that's happened, I think, in the academy at least, is that we're running away from something horrible and important that happened in this election. I hate to be so political about it, but it is. And that is that the Democrats and everybody to the left of the Democrats discovered, you know what? Black people do not all think alike. Latinos are not one monolithic group. Asian Americans may be targeted by those who hate Asian Americans, and they see a face and they assume that someone who's Korean is the same as Chinese and Vietnamese. But within the Asian American community, there are huge, huge differences. Exploitation is not exclusive to one group. So if we use the word people who are raced as, or if we say specifically who we're talking about, we're speaking about Jamaicans or Blacks in New York City, that's very different from Blacks in South Dakota or Wisconsin. And so I always just like to remind us that if we use the shorthand, I'm thinking of Barbara Field, of course, if we use the shorthand race, we're actually constantly recreating a myth, and that's what she describes as racecraft, but we're never actually talking about racism and economic injustice. So that's my pitch.
I think that's very important. And there is another question in the chat that says, how does race being biological correlate to race being a powerful social construct?
It correlates in the way, I'll use Barbara Field's example. The London Bridge is a social construct. We make it. But if one goes into a doctor's office, and really it can be irregardless of who the doctor is, you go into a doctor's office and you're very, very brown, or you're very, very white in color, and the doctor makes assumptions about your body based on what you look like, they can make terrible decisions. And I have a personal example of that when my son almost died of leukemia, and the doctor said, we're going to have to do a transplant. It was very nice. We're going to have to find a donor. Now, your son is Israeli and you're African American. And I said, you know what? Let's not even go there. This is my background. He halted me and said, oh, so you're international, go to the international bank. Now, why do we need to go to an international bank and not simply a computer? In the end, my daughter was the donor and everything worked out. Social race categories are learned. And those of you who are from the South, I'm not, will know that up until the 1960s, seeing a person who looked white did not mean that they were white.
Thank you. And a follow-up to that is, and the question has to do, so what should they do before applying to a university? What kind of experiences should they seek to have? And the fuller question is, what advice can, it came in two parts. So part of this whole discussion is going to move a little bit. What advice can you all give to younger women of color and Black women who are seeking to go after their doctorate? You know, how should they, what should they do before applying to a university? What kind of experiences should they seek to have? Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And that's for any one of you.
So I'll jump in here, and let me also say that I highly recommend Racecraft by Barbara Jean Fields. I mean, just fantastic book, completely changed the way I do work and think about the work that I do. So highly recommend Racecraft if y'all don't have it. In terms of higher education, you know, it's in a different place even when it was when I was applying. You know, again, I applied as someone who received my GED, and thankfully I was able to get some scholarship money to go off to college. That's a very different place than students are in now, which is that debt is very high. It's very difficult to pay for college. Costs are rising, not only in tuition, but in books and fees and et cetera. So, you know, the first thing I do is really think carefully about what that economic picture looks like. I don't think we should be prevented from going to college based on economics, but we should know what the impact's going to be going forward. So like if I take a student loan, for instance, me, and I'm still paying it off, that does have an economic impact for decades, right? And so that's not something I knew when I first went off to college. So I took out loans to pay for tuition. And it kind of feels like free money, and it's not, right? And it'll sneak up on you later. So really think about that economic picture and talk with folks who understand what you're going toward. I had a great counselor who I sat with. You know, seek out folks who have been on this path. Ask them about looking for scholarships, ask them about looking for fellowships, you know, think about that financial picture. And also, you know, as you think about that financial picture, you know, find your community, find folks maybe at the places you are applying to who would be interested in emailing with you or Zooming with you and giving you some helpful hints. One of the things I do with students, you know, first and second year students, is I sit down with them and we do a self-assessment. And I'm not their advisor, but I sort of ask them like, you know, so what are you trying to do? And are you taking the right classes? And sometimes we can save students a semester or two just by sitting down and doing an assessment with them. So find those people in your lives. When you find them, this is like just being older. Send thank you cards or thank you emails. You know, what has happened with me is, you know, I've asked someone for a letter of recommendation, or I've asked someone, you know, and they've spent an hour very generously with me, giving me advice and pointers that have saved me time and money. And then, you know, if I forget to send gratitude, which I always have and costs 32-cent stamp or whatever stamps cost now, you know, it's something I really want to do all the time, not just strategically, but to tell folks I appreciate them. The other thing that you'll notice is, like, you know, a year later or 6 months later, you may be returning to that person again. So it's always nice to share your gratitude. You feel it but sometimes you forget to sit down and type it out or write it out. So I'd recommend, use the sources around you, use the resources, and then make sure to share your gratitude to those sources.
I have to agree with Dr. Rodriguez. I think building and enhancing your network as well. Certainly, those note cards are a lost art nowadays. And making sure that you say those thank yous in fundraising. I tell you, a person could give $1. If you do not thank them in development work at least 7 times, they don't feel thanked. It doesn't matter how much they give, how little or how great of a resource they are. They simply want to be thanked and feel appreciated. And those are the people that are going to hire you and give you recommendations, because at the end of the day, people want to know who you know and what experience you have. Those people that you thanked over time will be the ones that hire you and give you those opportunities.
Thank you so much. I do have another question that came in earlier from an audience member. And while I'm asking the question, also, if my panelists could put their contact email address in the chat box in case someone is kind of shy and doesn't want to ask the question, but maybe want to ask you offline. The question here is, I have to take off my glasses. HBCUs often neglect or do not have an art department, and I would say maybe some MSIs as well, claiming that financial support is not viable. However, we expect and depend on artists to intellectually raise our culture through interdisciplinary methods. Not supporting creative departments adversely harms the careers of Black women educators who are also studio artists, while dismissing potential creative students. So how can colleges better respect and support, I would say, Black women, women who are in the category women of color, BIPOC, teaching artists now and future creatives? And this is not just Black women, but other non-white women in non-STEM fields. So.
I think for me and what I've experienced in my time here on this earth, I think definitely recruiting, first and foremost, within higher education. From what I experienced in undergrad and in working in a higher education environment, the arts are oftentimes, if not always, neglected. Reflecting on recruiting career development opportunities for students and faculty and staff within those departments. And then looking at colleges can better respect acknowledging the work that is done inside and outside of the classroom, financially supporting teaching artists and future creatives to be both marketable and competitive in those industries. Because I know, for example, here in North Carolina in the UNC system several years ago, the arts were either dissolved or consolidated. The art departments were consolidated. So I think across the board, the arts are just really just being diminished within higher education, and overall they're just looked down upon when the arts are what drive economies and the overall well-beings of nations.
I would only add the following. You know, the United States has never been particularly supportive of artists across the board. That's very different from outside of the United States. And depending on an institution, some institutions have strong art departments, art history, art studio. Some it's combined, some it's separate. Not all places have that. But if I think of the students who someday might become artists, someday might become teachers or professors, then my recommendation as a professor is to encourage students to seek curricular diversity. Their courses The courses, they want to be a doctor, their parents want them to be a doctor or an economist or a politician. That's good, you know, do that, but take an art class, take a drama class, take something in the humanities that you didn't consider taking. And at a school like Grinnell College, which is predominantly white, which is in Iowa, which does not necessarily have diversity. We happen to have some diversity in the art department now. It's not particularly visible either. It's diversity in background. But there are those students, and I will say specifically, there are those Black students, less so for Latino students, but there are those Black American students who hesitate to go outside of sociology. That's where I believe today, in 2021 and 2022, we need, it's different in a historically Black college or university. We need to encourage students that you can study racism, you can study all the current political issues, but you can also learn about the arts because they contribute to a better society. They also contribute to the ability to articulate a variety of ideas that don't always have to be explicit on the canvas or in the sculpture, in the digital arts, but nevertheless articulate those frustrations and beliefs that you may have in more creative ways. So, and then the last point, which ties back to something that was said before, the networking is so important. And Dean Johnson, you've been a lifesaver for me with a couple of my students who I said, did you call Dean Johnson? They haven't, but what's important is it's in their mind. And so by creating these kinds of networking conversations, we're able to create the networks for the next generation. So I very much appreciate all of you.
And I appreciate all of you too. We are 3 minutes out. And I think this has been a very rich conversation. It's just, I feel the beginning of a conversation that we can continue to have amongst each other and in different iterations. I'm so excited to see everyone on this call. And I will give each of you, we've got 3 minutes, 30 seconds to say your closing remarks. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating. So I will start this time. I'll start in the middle with Dr. Holmes Brothers.
Thank you so much again, Dean Johnson. I think Dr. Melvarot said it perfectly in networking, and I know that I've corresponded with you over many years with the African American Heritage Commission and with my younger cousin at Bennett College for Women. So I'm grateful for that lifeline of support. And I think just building upon networking, because you never know where it will lead and what opportunities might come about, even if not for yourself, but for someone close to you. So definitely empowering that network so that you have those that speak on your behalf when you aren't in the room.
Great, thank you. Dr. Meveroth, or Professor Meveroth. And I'm saying that deliberately because it is important to recognize also those titles we hold.
Yes, I do prefer to get called Katya, but there is something that titles, you know, the titles are important, especially if you are a woman, and it's easy to become informal. And when you become too informal, somebody I once met who was actually from the South said, if you let a dog lick at your hand, don't be surprised if they bite it. So I've learned to insist on the title, but not among friends. I think networking is the most important. And I also think, because I often don't do it and I have to force myself, reaching out. You know, I see a name on a screen and I think, I wonder who that person is. Dr. Wood, perhaps, Lynette Wood, or Dr. Richards, Dr. Marilyn Baldwin Richards. And I think, okay, I need to write that person. They might not write me back, but if I write them, they might write me back. And then we can exchange readings, films, questions, ideas. Otherwise, we're in echo chambers. And I am so upset about this last year. And I think that going forward, it is more important than ever that A, we put emphasis on economic justice, and B, that we get lots of different voices in the room, because if we stay in our echo chambers, the tiny victory that was won in November is going to get lost. Those are my closing words. Thank you.
Thank you. And our first will also be our last, Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson. I will say that what I've learned from this talk that's been reinforced today is that everything, my family taught me is true. It's not specialized knowledge, which is be kind to people, find your people. That has been critical for me. I tell my students when they come in as first years and second years, find your people, they will sustain you. And be kind and be respectful and be loving, and hype other people's work that you love and that you respect and admire. And for the arts, I have to say that what's so important about the arts. I work with Carolina Performing Arts and the Humanities for the Public Good here. They work with all of my courses because I can't carry a tune in a paper bag, right? I'm not an artist. But it's important to our work because it not only reflects our social relationships, but it constructs them. And so it's always very important for us to stay engaged in the arts and to respect that visionary imagination that sometimes is what we need to move forward. And so thank you all again for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, and show our appreciation with claps or reaction down. Thank you all panelists. Thank you, Jeff Tippett and Institutional Advancement for helping us get this together. Always appreciate the support we get from our administration, Dr. Dusenberry and President Dillard. So go forward, everyone. Contemplate, connect, 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 connect. And Dean Wood knows what I'm referring to on that one.
Spacecraft today.
Thank you all.